All right, hi everybody. I'm Virginia with the SISGI Beyond Good Ideas Foundation. Good to see you all here today. So for those of you who are new to SISGI and the Beyond Good Ideas Foundation, our mission is to increase the capacity of change makers and organizations working for social good. We do this in a few ways. One is through our social change leadership program, which is a career-based virtual internship experience for students and nonprofit and community professionals in the field. And I see some of our interns in the audience today. Good to see you all. And if you could all just please remember to mute yourselves during the event, and we'll have some time for you all to unmute yourselves and ask questions towards the end. Thank you. An additional part of our work here at the Beyond Good Ideas Foundation is today's social change leadership or social change career series. These are conversations that we have frequently throughout the year where we invite professionals in the field to come and talk about their career journey, just to highlight the diversity of careers related to social good. We're super, super excited today to have Phil Ingram, who is an employment attorney, a law instructor for UC Hastings, and a former board member of the SISGI Beyond Good Ideas Foundation. So we're super interested to have them here to discuss social change from a different viewpoint, the legal perspective, which we don't often get to hear from. Just to let you all know a little bit about how today will flow, I'll ask some questions of Phil. And then, like I said, there'll be time in the end for all of you to chime in and ask some questions you have for them as well. So without further ado, Phil, why don't you kick us off by introducing us to Phil Ingram and your career journey to start?
Thank you, Jenny, and hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here. Whenever Thanara Bailey asks me to do something, I'm definitely always there. She's great, and I'm sure all of you will either get the chance to work with Thanara or you already have, so you know that too. I am currently an employment attorney, and you may have seen that I work for the federal government. I just want to highlight that I'm here in my personal capacity today. I don't speak for the government. They wouldn't want me to, even if they could, right? So I started my career journey in a really sort of circuitous path. I graduated from undergrad in 2008, which you may remember was not the best time to be a person looking for entry-level jobs. I took the first thing that fell off the turnip truck, which was like an admin job at the college I was going to at NYU. That blossomed into me being a shop steward and being kind of a union gadfly, being the person who was always making it hard for management to do what they wanted to do, even if they had the right to. I sort of disagreed with that, so I didn't play along. That led me to wanting to do labor and employment law. That's where I've been ever since. I went to law school, and it was interesting when I remembered this when I was sort of reflecting on what Jenny was saying the conversation would be about. As part of my law school admissions process, I remember having an interview with one of the associate deans, and she asked me, well, Phil, just based on what you're saying about what you want to do, why aren't you going into social work? Like, why not just get an MSW? And of course, I gave some sort of pageant answer about the law being a different set of, tools and giving you different skills. But it also it's amazing how much overlap there is between these two professions. I think people forget that, it seems like they have very separate spheres, or when you're sort of dealing with clients, you're only dealing with sort of like one person's issues or one person's, needs in either context. But there are a lot of spaces in social work and law where you are making macro and meso changes. And I think that's a really important overlap that sometimes we all forget. The professions have more of a relationship than we think. Since I graduated law school, I've been working primarily for the federal government. I do labor and employment law on the defense side, which isn't something I ever thought I would be doing. But working for the government doing defense side has actually been great, because the government is required to be a model employer. It's required to sort of live up to the values that Congress and the Department of Labor and all the various agencies of the federal government have set. So my job isn't to sort of bang my fist on the table and pretend that discrimination didn't happen. My job is to fix it. My job is to make sure that we're putting people in the right place, or if if nothing really illegal happened, that we're protecting public resources. So it's an interesting spin on what I was doing before, because I'm sort of on the opposite side and kind of getting back the karma that I put out in the universe as a shop steward. Since I've been in law, I've also had the opportunity to teach legal research and writing at UC Hastings, which has been really fun. I've also, as Jenny mentioned, I served for about 7 years on the inaugural board of the Beyond Good Ideas Foundation. So I've gotten to meet a lot of the students who've come to the SISGI intern program. I've gotten to work on a lot of the different sort of policy and sort of overarching things that the NARA wanted to do with the organization when it was brand new. So sort of a long introduction to me, but that's my career thus far. And we'll see what else happens as the years roll by.
Okay, you mentioned a lot of interesting things. I have a couple follow-up questions. So I just want to know, so you kind of hinted that, in your job, your role is to make sure that that we fix discrimination, not to pretend that it didn't happen. So what does a typical day, week, month look like in the world of an employment attorney in general?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of different practice. I think, and obviously social workers will understand this better than other people, but work is a primary relationship. People spend a lot of time at their workplaces. They spend a lot of time developing dynamics with the people at their workplaces. So there's a lot you can do. If you work for the government on the enforcement side, like if you work for the EEOC, for example, you're basically prosecuting cases under the Civil Rights Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act and these other employment discrimination statutes. Additionally, if you work sort of like I do in an institutional sort of in-house capacity, that day or week is usually sort of taken up with litigation and with advice work. You're basically in email jail unless you have a court or some other appearance to make. It's also the employment and labor sort of space also has a lot of work for people who want to do things on the work side of things. So people who really are focused on making sure that individual people are being paid what they're legally entitled to, people who want to, serve class actions for employers who are breaking rules on sort of a systematic level. But I think the general contours are all the same, that we all have to sort of be keeping up with the law. We have to be making sure that we're current on what's happening in the real world. And we also have to make sure that we're checking in with how the sort of underlying social values are changing the way the law is interpreted. As an example of that, the Civil Rights Act really on this sort of aspect of sex discrimination hasn't changed in the text since the 1960s. There's been like one amendment for pregnancy discrimination, but that didn't add anything that we wouldn't have already thought. What is interesting about it is that in the time period that has gone on since then, though, that rule has been expanded to cover sexual harassment. It's been expanded to cover sex stereotyping. It's been expanded to cover gender nonconforming, trans, and sort of gender minority folks. It's been really sort of stretched in this way. And that's because as the social conversation changes, judges are influenced and they change how they are interpreting the law. So part of every employment attorney's job is to try to also ride the wave of what's happening in the culture. How does this affect what I'm doing or what my workplace should be doing? And even the most hardened defense attorney wouldn't be trying to argue the Civil Rights Act as it existed in the 60s in 2022. So, it's hard to generalize, just what everyone is doing, but I think that's what most people are focused on, is making sure they understand how our culture is changing so that we can understand how to make workplaces live up to these sort of mandates from the 60s and 70s and 80s as it is now, rather than as it was written then.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That makes a lot of sense, that the way the law is interpreted depends on the culture and society at the time. And we definitely see that happening to this day. So it sounds like, and you were saying there is a lot of crossover between social work and law. How do you feel that your work makes a difference for social good or in social issues?
Yeah, so it's an interesting kind of thing, right? Because I don't do sort of macro level work. I'm not writing policies, I'm not writing laws, that's not what I'm focused on. But what I am always focused on are sort of two maybe competing interests, right? And one of them is to sort of be delivering an honest assessment of what is happening in the world and how that relates to the law, so that everyone can sort of understand and be on the same playing field about what the rules of engagement really are at work. That doesn't make you popular with people who want the rules to be different, either in either direction. People have a lot of really, sort of high sort of passions about what goes on at work, and they think, well, my way needs to be how the law is, which is not necessarily the case. So part of that is just about sort of openly communicating so that people can have the same expectations and have a better workplace as a result, right? I mean, if you and your boss are fighting about a disagreement on something, one of you needs to be educated on what the right answer is, or on how you're going to sort of bridge that gap if not. That second part sort of leads me into the thing that maybe is competing, where it's recognizing that the law and the tools that come from it are really lacking. I don't think it would shock any of you to learn that federal civil rights law might not be doing everything that it says it can do. And it might also not be the best, mechanism to make social change to, for example, every time someone's fired from their workplace for being disabled, for them to go chase a federal lawsuit, really isn't the only way to get relief, and isn't really the best way for a lot of people. For a lot of people, things like litigation are sort of traumatic. And they usually end up with the employer winning because our laws aren't that great. So it's also about recognizing that the law is kind of is an incomplete tool set, and understanding that, sort of like you do in social work, that there are sort of also biopsychosocial factors that are going in here, so that when we're talking to people about what needs to change in their workplace, or why their expectations maybe are unreasonable of their workplace, we're also thinking about, well, yeah, that's the law, but really, what should we be doing to be better than the law? What are we doing to stand away from that cliff's edge of the law and really sort of play by a fairer and sort of and I don't want to say progressive because that sounds political, but in a way that sort of makes workplaces better over time. So it's about sort of that honest communication of what the law is, and kind of having those same sort of general nucleus of understanding, but also seeing the ways in which the law is lacking and how should we respond to that? How can we be better than the law is asking us to be? Not necessarily just minimally comply with the law.
So that's interesting. So it sounds like a lot of your work is not necessarily based on how are we going to go forward with this lawsuit, but what are the other ways that we can address this issue and managing expectations, and kind of pulling in from a bunch of different disciplines, not necessarily just focused on law. And from my social work lens, I tend to think of law as a really great way to address social change and to forward social change. Certainly it is invariably linked, but like you said, there are other ways. And so we need to look at it from a holistic perspective, and litigation can be traumatic for folks. So I appreciate that perspective. I'm just curious, I want to take a step back for a moment. You kind of alluded to it, but I want to hear more about the process of what actually made you choose to go to law school versus social work or another discipline that you may have been attracted to.
Yeah, so and this maybe sort of dovetails what we were speaking about earlier. I think everyone who comes to the legal profession either is from a family of lawyers, which isn't my case, right? Like, I am like rough and tumble hillbilly from like Kentucky. Like, no one in my family went to college before I did. So this was not like a family dynasty thing. Or you come to it with the expectation that, like, the law that you see in the movies, not necessarily on TV, but what you see in the movies of like the Aaron Brockovich moments, or the on the basis of sex type thing can happen, where, one smart person and a bunch of books can find like this one weird trick and make social change, or can protect people in different ways. That really is kind of naive. That's, I think a lot of people come to it with that understanding. And it really doesn't work like that in the real world. Like that's really, even if you look at the career trajectories of people who do impact litigation and stuff, that's really not what typically happens with folks. But I think that's maybe why I was attracted to law. But I would be remiss not to mention the fact that I got into a little bit of a workplace dispute with my manager at the time. And he had asked me to stay at the job for no less than a certain amount of time. And I applied to law school to have like a reason to spite him. So just keep in mind that, motivations come from a lot of different places. Like, so both of those things working together kind of pushed me into, you know what? No, I need to make a career change. I need to dedicate myself to something real. And also, well, turn the screw a little bit, which I always liked to do when I was just a straight line employee. So.
I love that, but you stuck with it.
Yeah, and hey, it works.
Despite the
it does work
motivation.
out.
Yeah. So us as social workers who might not be as familiar with various tools in the legal system, how can we use law in our social change efforts? Or what should we know?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. So I think one thing that I would say is, and obviously this applies to like certain types of social work, right, is that there are sort of macro level changes that you can make at a policy level. We can advocate for a law to be passed that will do X, Y, and Z. We can advocate that a regulatory agency take a new approach to how it enforces this law. Those are all the types of advocacy that I think at like a macro level really work in social work. What really does sort of break down, though, and I think a lot of people have this idea, is that if you take one person's individual case, it's almost impossible to translate that into a systemic change. Obviously, there are cases that do that. Some of the big civil rights cases had one plaintiff on them, and that just like bubbled up through the system. But for every Jane Roe, or for every Brown and Brown versus Board of Education, for every Obergefell, for each of those people, there are thousands of people left in the wake of that who judges didn't take seriously, or who got really railroaded on motion practice, or who had cases that were just as meritorious and had the same exact legal theories, but the culture wasn't ready to accept them. So when I think of using law in social work and sort of individual social advocacy, obviously, aside from like making sure you get everyone their benefits and making sure that everyone is, able to access the sort of rights that the law gives them, the reality is that sort of pushing people toward litigation is rarely a way to make social change. It can make individual change that has like really huge effects in people's lives and their families' lives. But it's important to sort of like understand that the law is separate from its outcomes. And in the litigation world, you're not likely to get sort of social change more than one person's sort of having their switch flipped in a certain way. So I think it's about sort of modulating those expectations and understanding how we can do that. If I had a plug for anything, by the way, and this, as someone who's interested in social change, again, not to be political about it, but the federal courts have changed a lot since 2017. It's not even a question. And the stuff that we're seeing come out of the Supreme Court right now is really different from what I think we could have expected in the 70s or 80s even. Even as the court was becoming more conservative, now the entire judiciary has really kind of been remade in a different kind of image. And a lot of people in the social good and social change spaces have gotten used to going to the courts to right wrongs, or depending on a judge to understand why this action that was unfair to this person is also unconstitutional or illegal, or there should be a broad pronouncement about that. And that toolkit, to the extent it was ever really useful, is being dismantled from within. So, if you're really interested in making sort of big impact changes in the law, that has to come from policy advocacy. It has to come from advocating with regulatory bodies. So I just encourage you to think about that differently, because I think we've been told since we were kids that the the arc of our constitutional law and of our federal law is bending toward progressive things and good social change. And that just really isn't the case anymore, if it ever was.
Yeah, and like you're saying, things haven't progressed the way they were, and in society, things ebb and flow, lean more conservative, progressive, not to get political, but that just the way that it is. And so, we work with mostly marginalized and oppressed communities. And when we start to see policies that are rolled back for those communities, or litigation that doesn't serve our clients that we're trying to serve, how do you keep from getting frustrated in litigation? And if things don't go your way, or if society isn't kind of going the way that we'd expect, how do you keep from getting discouraged and like from the progress that you perceivably have been making over the past several years?
Yeah, no, it's, I mean, obviously the sort of activist burnout and all of that, like there are millions of think pieces you can go read now, but I think what's most important is to understand that like feelings of frustration and feelings that the legal system is not responsive to things that are sort of like obvious urgent needs or that make complete logical sense within its own sort of framework. Those are completely valid reactions, and they don't come from a place of being burnt out or being selfish or having sort of some grandiose expectations. They come from the reality that our legal system is broken. And if your goal of the legal system is social change, again, sort of like a social work thing, like are you an agent of social change or social control? And our legal system is not really set up for social change. We've gotten used to since the 70s and 80s that it can be used for that, but that's being rolled back. So it's I would say that being frustrated or getting discouraged are like natural reactions, but it's important to understand how to pivot or to sort of see the problem where it is, rather than hoping for a different outcome. If only I had, the case were different, or if only it were different plaintiffs, or if only I hadn't gotten that judge. That could all be true. But just remember that when you're entering that arena, they're only playing one game. So is that the game you want to be playing? Is that game really going to result in you moving the needle on the things you want to move the needle on? It probably isn't. And so it's important to have that perspective and sort of be more realistic about what you can and can't do. Unless, of course, you hit the lottery. Obviously, you might hit the lottery where you get that one case that changes constitutional law forever, but that's a very rare situation.
Right. I think that's important. Because like you said, probably that if you're that lottery ticket where you're the plaintiff that creates social change, there's probably hundreds, if not thousands, who have come before you. So just managing those expectations and understanding what place the law has and pivoting and being creative. I think I could speak, if I could speak for social workers, I think we are pretty good at being creative and pivoting.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and using the law for that macro level scale, that advocacy piece. I really like that advice. Our leadership program is mostly macro students, and our internship program is geared towards macro social work practice. So we do have a lot of cause marketing and advocacy campaigns that our interns actually develop and implement. So this would actually be a great segue to, I want to bring up a question from Jess Smith, who submitted this before today's meeting in her Zoom RSVP. Jess, if you want to come off mute, not to put you on the spot, and ask your question, or I could just read it off, whatever you prefer. Not sure if she's there. I see her camera's off. Okay, so I'll go ahead and ask it for her. She wants to know, do you recommend? Oh, she said, go ahead and read it. Okay, will do. She says, do you recommend a law degree to provide a specific advantage for people pursuing social change careers? And if so, why or why not?
Um, so I don't think it's lost on anybody that if you look around the political class in our country, a lot of them are lawyers. A lot of them have that skill set to be able to like understand how to write laws, understand regulations, and sort of understand the place where that exists. So, you know, having that background helps you be able to be part of a conversation that otherwise you might be excluded from, because this profession is built around gatekeeping, right? I mean, let's not be cute about it. The law is meant to exclude people from understanding it. Everything lawyers in court say to you to the contrary, if they wanted the law to be understood, they would be doing a whole different thing, right? This just is very clear. So having that ability to speak the language of the law and understand how legal analysis proceeds and understanding how legal processes work can't ever hurt you in that. But I would also encourage you to think about the fact that the gatekeeping that happens in this profession is specifically done, and this is not like there's like a handbook that says this, right? But it's meant to keep people out who would want the system to change fundamentally, right? It's meant to keep, like, if you have been unfairly convicted of a crime, for example, it doesn't matter how smart you are, the legal profession will figure out a way to keep you out in the moral and character fitness part of the discussion, right? And that's just part of the deal. So there is a way in which getting into the law differently from other professions can set you up to sort of be only able to think through that system and kind of work within that system as though it's the one that matters the most. So it has that drawback. And, you know, it's so if I had to sort of put the fine point on it, like, yes, it's a good place to go learn the language of making policy and understanding how to even get in those rooms. And it has the sort of social cachet that allows you to do that as well. But also it really ensconces you in a system and makes you, it gives you a vested interest in that system's continuation in a way that might not be that helpful to your advocacy.
Thank you for that. As a law instructor, as an educator, just as somebody who's successful in your career, what one piece of advice would you have for our students who are thinking about their next step, or professionals out there who may be thinking about their next move?
Yeah, so if you're already in grad school, the one thing to remember is that it's not about the content, right? Like, this is the sort of joke of grad school, is that what you're learning in the classes, some of it you need to have for the profession, right? You've got to learn how to use the DSM if you're going to be a clinical social worker. Like, that's not a question, but most of what you're doing there isn't learning the skills, it's networking with people. It's making a good impression on your peers and on your professors and meeting people who are in the spaces that you want to be in. It's really hard to break into a space that you have no connection to. That's not going to shock any social workers, right? Like, you can't just walk up to a courthouse and start trying to meet people because you want to know more lawyers. That's just not the way people interact. So getting into grad school, you know, obviously there's the academic component to it, but one thing that I'm trying to impress on my students, and I wish had been kind of more impressed upon me when I was in graduate school, is that you're really not there for the content or to become the smartest person in the room on that topic. What you're there for is to be able to enter into a social space where these issues are on the table and where you get a voice. So if you're approaching graduate school from the level of just, I want to learn this academically and just sort of like clock in and clock out of class, you won't get as much from it if your goal is to figure out how I get in these spaces where I can make social change. If you're not in graduate school, or if you're just sort of thinking about how to do that, it's the same kind of thing would apply. You have to go meet the people who are doing this. I think there is especially in the age of blogging and of like online personality and branding, I think there's this idea that you can just sort of like catch influence, or that you can kind of be in spaces just because you're entering them. And that's really not the way it works. Like you can be the sort of hottest taker on Twitter, but if you're not actually out there doing work and talking to people who are doing real stuff, then you're just a sort of angry person making tweets, right? So it's important to kind of remember that at the end of the day, your professional goal, no matter what it is, requires you to work with other people. It requires you to collaborate, and it requires you to understand the sort of professional language of the space you want to be in. So however you get to that is kind of the goal, rather than, you know, even if you think about like, well, my ultimate goal is to make this kind of social change. Like I want this policy implemented. You know, that really doesn't matter until you're in that room and in that space and you have those sort of tools to interact with the people who can connect you with the places that make those changes, or who understand how to support you to do that. So, you know, that's a kind of a long-winded way of saying, like, make sure you're developing your network, you're watering your garden, you're putting in those social deposits, and also that you're sort of reaching out to people who maybe you wouldn't expect to be valuable to your network, because I'm sure you all know, like, this is sort of basic networking theory. The loose ties between groups are the people who really help make your social network complete and introduce you to new people. So it's all about sort of making sure you're getting out there in a way that sort of actually serves your ultimate goals, not just in the way that you think is like the most direct path to getting this law passed, or the most direct path to getting this person relief. You know, you really have to kind of work your whole circle and try to make sure you're maintaining those relationships above everything else.
Yeah, that's absolutely, that's something that we also encourage our interns to do through the internship program. Network, have informational interviews with individuals you come across, be on the board or go to community events. This is why we have conversations like this, for people to network, be an active participant in your graduate education. I love that advice. It's not just sitting in class and absorbing the information. You have to take risks, be bold, in order to make the most of it. Absolutely. So I want to go back to one thing you said. You know, the law is not necessarily comprised, or the legal system is not necessarily comprised of people who want to be in it to change it, because there's a lot of gatekeeping. And so for those who you know, aren't you know, a majority member of whatever industry it is that they want to get into, who might experience some hurdles. So the example you gave earlier would be if an individual has a former record, right? What would be your advice to them for getting into these spaces where they can use their voice and they can be an agent of social change, even though people in that space don't necessarily look or are like them?
Yeah, no, and that's I think a lot of people, like the profession as a whole, right? My profession is allegedly trying really hard to diversify itself and get rid of these gatekeepings. But you know, until we get rid of, you have to go to a second layer of graduate school that you have to take a separate admissions exam for, and you also have to take a bar exam. Like until we get rid of all those filters, like all of that's illusory. So whatever. If you find yourself in a position where you are not able to break through those barriers, or you realize that breaking through those barriers is so costly or would require you to sort of like give up, you know, sort of major parts of yourself, it's important to think about the pivot there, right? So there are a lot of places where, you know, you're not doing legal services directly, but you're doing policy advocacy, or you're, if you're thinking about the ways in which the spaces that you want to be in don't exist, then that might be a signal to you to go create those spaces. Now, obviously, that puts a huge burden on folks, right? Like, let's not be cute about it. Starting your own business or starting an agency or sort of launching something on your own is scary, and it's intensive, and it can take a lot of resources that folks don't have. So it's not something to do lightly, but just remember that you have other options. There's always a different way to approach these questions where you can sort of touch different parts of the problem. Once you're touching different parts of the problem, you're closer to solving it than maybe you were when you were just totally on the sidelines. So, to the extent that you can keep yourself from being sidelined in the first place, that would be like the miracle pill, right? Like just go to law school or just start your own company. Like there'll be no problem. Like that's obviously not sustainable advice. But it is to think about the fact, like, where are those conversations happening already? How can I get into those adjacent spaces and start making hops or start thinking about what the next steps are? And what you might find out is that, in fact, you came into the idea thinking that there were a lot of changes you needed to make in a specific realm or using a specific set of tools. And what you really find out is that there's a lot more nuance to the issue, or there's a lot of complexity that you didn't really appreciate from the outside. And maybe you can help, like even just tinkering around the edges sometimes can make huge differences in people's lives. So, have an open mind and try to figure out how you can get closest to the issues that you want to work on, even if there are structures keeping you out from the sort of like center of the power circle.
Oops, I muted. That's great advice. I really like that. And, as you said, that it's a lot of onus on the person. So talking about system level, what would you like to see more of as far as diversity and equity? And how can we be mindful to be more inclusive, diverse, equitable in our daily workspaces, daily operations?
Yeah, no, and I mean, that's obviously like, that's kind of a $1 billion question for a lot of organizations and a lot of professions, is how do we diversify, right? But and I'm sure everyone understands this, right? Like what that has become is sort of chasing numbers or hoping that numbers by themselves will indicate something bigger. But what I think we're finding out more and more is that the real issue is not just diversity for its own sake, and not just equity sort of like on paper, there's like an equality of either like starting points or whatever, but it's about that inclusion. It's about actually seeking out those voices that are excluded. It's about actively making sure that you're including those voices as you go down the line. So if you think about the employment relationship, for example, American law premises the employment relationship on what used to be called at common law the master-servant relationship. This is not like a secret to anybody. They now, like, courts will dress it up and say the employer-employer relationship, but like the employee-employer relationship is just a rename of the master-servant relationship. So if you're in a space like that where you have the power to include your subordinates and the decisions that you're making, or to seek out those different opinions and really include them meaningfully in how you operate within the spheres of influence that you have, that's probably one of the only effective ways that as an individual, you can make that happen. So for example, let's say you're a line supervisor at your job, right? And someone comes to you with a problem. It can seem really easy to kind of just like sally forth and I'm going to, like, be for the worker or whatever. But the reality is that is one type of solution. And the other solution that you have more power over is the next time that you're making a policy about something, or the next time you're making a decision about something, even if you don't have to include people with less power, make it part of your practice to do that, to actively seek out all of those things and figure out how you can incorporate them. That adds a lot of time to processes, and sometimes you don't have that time. But if DEI is a priority for you, then that's how you make that time. You add those extra layers in, so it's not just you sort of operating on your own implicit biases or doing what you've always been told should happen or doing what the system hopes that you will do, but that you're actually meaningfully collecting those experiences and letting everyone make a joint decision. That's a better way to sort of manage things than kind of just the top-down operating style that we're used to. I use the employment relationship as the example there, but the fact is that most of our social relationships work that way. Most of our social relationships are focused on that there's a hierarchy, there's someone who's in charge, and there's someone who's receiving exercises of power. And until we think about how to lateralize power and share it, I don't think we're going to get a lot of really good DEI outcomes, just as a society and as a profession. Definitely not in the law profession anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I know in the nonprofit sector, there's a lot of focus now on how our unbalanced power dynamics in the workplace and hierarchies, embedded hierarchies, directly antithetical to the work we're trying to do in the community.
Yeah.
So that being chain of command structures, that being private donations from wealthy elites. And so how do we ensure that these embedded social hierarchies are, how are we dismantling these to further reinforce the work that we're doing in the community? Absolutely. And all we can do at this point as managers is understand these power dynamics and make a conscious effort within our power, within our small teams, to ensure that we are making work a little more equitable and creating a safe space for individuals who might not be comfortable using their voice in certain spaces. So
yeah, and
absolutely.
also, by the way, just to piggyback on that, it's also about recognizing like that, you know, when you're in these systems, like for example, you talk about like mega donors, for example, right? Like your organization is maybe really held to one person who really gives a lot of money, so you're definitely not crossing them or any of their political boundaries. Like you don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? You're not gonna, you know, it's better that you have the money to go make social change than that you don't have that money. But it's important to always be conscious of the decisions you're making and try not to justify them in ways that sort of excuse your own role in perpetuating those systems. And this is something that I struggle with as a defense side lawyer. I know a lot of my colleagues, it's really easy to kind of drink the Kool-Aid on a case because you want to win or because you know that this is like the right answer is this. And it's always really important to step back and understand like, no, in this situation, like the right answer is unfair. And I have to own that. I have to understand it, because if I don't understand it, then I am just perpetuating the system on its own grounds. And I'm not actually going to be able to recognize the places where I don't have to do this. I don't have to make these compromises in every situation. So when am I going to draw the line? I think it just helps you do that, to be aware that your own actions can be unfair, they can be unjust. Yeah. They can be antithetical to your work, and you have to kind of sit with that discomfort to be able to recognize when you don't have to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Being vigilant about your own biases and your own self-interest. Absolutely. We're about 15 minutes out from the end. So, and thank you for this conversation. I love having these macro level systemic conversations. It always ends up like that with me. So thank you for humoring me. I wanted to pause and make sure everybody in the audience has a chance to ask a question if they have one. So feel free to raise your hand, unmute yourself, type any questions you might have in the box. Sophie, did I see your hand? Oh, Andy. Oh, Andy. Sorry, Andy,
sure.
right?
Yeah, you got it right the second time. Thank you so much. Thank you, Phil, for coming in today. I think it's really awesome that you took the time out of what seems like a very rich life to come and have a great conversation with us. So I just wanted to share that I feel like I have a lot to relate to what you said. I graduated from high school in 2009. So I also went into the beginning of my work world at the height of the bubble popping and the recession that we went into. So I kind of was able to have some empathy with you there. And then I'm also myself interested in social change in law. I've been thinking with my social work degree going into the government and working on policies that are related to environmental injustice and environmental racism. And so my question for you is, with that in mind, and considering how law is a very complex and diverse area, what type of law, or maybe like the 3 top, would you consider would be the best way for me to go into law? Like government law, policy, like what is it? How would you articulate that?
Yeah, so thank you for that. So with environmental justice and environmental racism, I mean, these conversations have been going on so long that it can feel kind of sickening, right? How long it's taken the government to really catch up. I mean, the government has known, it's not been a secret. Like, why are we putting the wastewater treatment on that side of town? Gee whiz, don't know. Like, those are things that we have known for so long and done nothing about, that it really is going to take macro level policy changes to address them. It's not a question of individual litigation at that point. I mean, maybe it is for some folks, but when you have an issue like the Flint water crisis, or when you look at just sort of our general environmental racism in the US, particularly because we have done nothing to stop it, basically, the issue isn't one that you can sort of sue your way out of on the Aaron Brockovich type model, right? Individual communities might be helped that way, but the reality is that you need policy level solutions to correct for these major historical injustices that are also going to require massive transfers of wealth. It shouldn't be lost on anyone that if you lived in the part of town that didn't have a water treatment facility in it, you had health outcomes that were better for generations. Your property value was higher for generations to come. That is unjust enrichment on the backs of other people in that context. So you do need to be in those policy making spaces to be able to advocate for that level of change and that level of wealth transfer. I don't see how else you could do it. Of course, there are also nonprofits who are working on this issue who do really awesome work and make really big impacts. So I don't mean to like sort of downgrade what that work is, and it's very crucial. But if you look at something like, how do I make that policy? So you could enter into government, right? And the government is very constraining in the ways that it's constraining. That can't be lost on anyone, right? You can have the most awesome and most clearly meritorious idea in the world, but if the EPA administrator doesn't like what's going on there, it's never going to come to fruition. It's just not, that's just the political nature of the beast. Or there are outfits like the Natural Resources Defense Council, where they do really great lobbying work, and they really put a lot of pressure on politicians to do what's right. That type of approach, I think, is what makes the most sense, is to sort of figure out, how do I turn my law focus onto that macro level? How do I focus it on policy rather than individual impact? Again, individual impact work can be really rewarding, but at a time when the federal judiciary has been really primed to be against the administrative state and really against ideas of discriminatory impacts of policy being as important as intentional discrimination, at a time when the courts are like that, you really need to be thinking about, in my opinion, going to those policy places, either advocating for policy, writing policy. It's just going to take a different level of work than I think litigation could give you. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's just sort of my reaction to what you were asking.
It was. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy, for that question. Sophie, go ahead.
Yeah, I just really want to say I appreciated how you acknowledged the law is like pretty black and white, and that people who are involved in the law are kind of only playing one game, because I feel like a lot of times lawyers kind of dance around that question. So I thought that was really refreshing, how you were like, let's not be cute about it, like this is happening.
Right.
And how the law is like very separate from its outcomes, because I've kind of dabbled with wanting to be a lawyer, going back and forth, but I kind of felt like I was contributing to a broken system. So I like really appreciated your perspective on that. And like to that regard, a lot of people say that the law and just the justice system in general is kind of like the cornerstone, or like they kind of have to pick up the pieces of a lot of other failing systems in society, and they kind of get the brunt of the blame of a lot of stuff like that. And you kind of mentioned, so the federal courts, the direction that they're heading is something that's like very much scared me just in my life, and just the way that politics are leaning. And I was just wondering if you think that just like policy and advocacy are like enough for real social change, or there needs to be like structural reforms to like the federal judiciary or just the like legal system in general, if structural reforms are even a possibility to fathom.
Yeah,
that sounded really pessimistic, but
hey, if you can't be a nihilist at 1 p.m., when can you? No, I think so. To sort of break down what you were saying and sort of my reaction to it, obviously, if I had my druthers, and one of the reasons that I do not speak for the government when I'm not on my government computer is because like the whole system is kind of a teardown at this point, right? I mean, I hope that doesn't like surprise anybody, but like there's really not a lot to vouch for the system we have now. A structural change is, I think, the minimum thing that would need to happen to take a country that was founded on a very intensive exploitative model of slavery and genocide and update that. And by the way, this is not just the US, right? Like this is the entire system as it exists now all over the world. Like you can't really leave, you can't go to any country and be exempted from the stains and horrors of colonialist capitalism. You can't do it. So yeah, I think systemic change is probably what one does need, but also short of like, you know, taking up guerrilla warfare, what's the girl to do? You know, that's really just, there's not something you can say about that. So I think understanding what the cost of playing along in the system is also understanding that the system's being inherently broken means that you have to kind of make peace with the idea that this is the type of change I can make, or this is the type of change I'm willing to participate in. You know, that obviously looks different on everyone's radar and everyone's sort of calculus on what you're going to do with that. And to also revisit a point you were talking about where people sort of say, you know, the criminal justice system particularly does absorb a lot of our social problems. In America, we are particularly good at this, is saying like that social problem is actually just criminality. So, you know, if you're not at work during daylight hours, you're a vagrant and you need to be in jail. Or if you're using narcotics, you're a bad, evil person and you go to jail. I think we've seen that the outcomes of that system are really awful and have not done what they were supposed to do. In addition to being an awful use of our resources, right? We could have spent that money any other way and had a much better society. But I would say that I don't let the criminal justice system off the hook for that, because as much as it has been politically expedient to go through and lock up people, or there have been economic incentives to lock people up so you could subject them to involuntary servitude, the reality is that individual people within that system make those choices, and those people are voted into power by us in like the local community. So for example, in San Francisco, the DA Chesa Boudin was specifically put in power to try to start dismantling and over policing on San Francisco streets and trying to get rid of some of the police brutality that had come to characterize the SFPD's way of dealing with people in marginalized communities. But what has happened is that the people of San Francisco are mad because they perceive that to be related to an uptick in crime, right? Like oh, there are more broken windows on the street, or the Walgreens are closing because so many people are stealing, you know, $4 perfumes. Like, who knows what's going on with that calculation? But until we get serious about supporting individual actors who don't want to over-criminalize problems, or who say, honestly, listen, I understand that there are a lot of high people on the street and it's hard to walk over them on your way to your fancy job, but that's not a criminal issue. That's a social issue that you can take care of differently. Until we're willing to support those people, even when the times get hard, the incentives are just such that the system will continue to be abused, and we really have to kind of take accountability for that. So I don't know if that answers, I think I kind of heard like those two ideas in your question, so I just wanted to respond to them. But I hope that gave you kind of my outlook on it.
Yeah, as you know, Phil, I just moved to San Francisco, so I want to put a plug in for, we need to have another conversation about San Francisco and all of these changes, and it's been an interesting transition.
Yeah, and by the way, cities have reacted differently. You know, if you've looked at New York, like the election of Mayor Adams is not like a coincidence, right? Like, it's very much a reaction to it's like an anti-defund the police backlash. I mean, it's kind of one-to-one how these things work. So it's interesting to even think how they compare between cities in the country, because their approaches are very different. Right.
And so going back to Sophie's question, and you stating, you know, system needs a teardown. So, but does that teardown just look very piecemeal and slow and kind of locality by locality?
I mean, I think that's what we've been trying to do, and I don't know that's been successful. I also don't think that you can solve, for example, if you take a problem like environmental justice, yeah, it's really easy to say like, nowhere in this city or this county shall you build a landfill. But if there's one 2 minutes down the road, all of those problems are in the groundwater, they're in the air, they're, the people who are being displaced will be displaced to different places or from different places. So, to me, there's not really a piecemeal solution, but no one's asking me for that. No one's asking me for my opinion on that. So that's what I would say is that, I think a teardown to be meaningful has to be coordinated. It has to be large enough to encompass the problem. And I don't know that individual sort of locality-based actions have been successful to do that, even though those kinds of actions can have meaningful impacts for their local communities. And if that's the area that you're focused on is in that meso level, then by God, don't let that go. Like, there are people who are suffering, you can help them. But is that going to solve the overall issue? I don't think so.
Yeah, it's hard to see how we could have a coordinated effort for system level change, even though I think a majority of Americans are for it. I was just thinking this the other day, we seem more divided than ever. And, how can we get better at just having one-on-one conversations and talking to each other again? And until that happens, it seems not very hopeful. Couple minutes left. Does anybody have any other questions, thoughts?
I see Keith's hand.
I was just gonna ask, based off of, what you were saying about, the ideas of the Civil Rights Act, like standing now and that being, a little bit aged and weathered, and the nature of the gatekeeper environment of law. You as a young lawyer, how do you feel like the climate of, I guess, people entering the space is changing or adapting to, I guess, a more modern society where, we have access to all these images. Everybody has a phone, everybody can get on social media and communicate. And, I think it's a lot harder to isolate the things that are keeping us, down and oppressed and, say and be okay about it. The same way that our forefathers, would. And so I think I'm curious to you as, a young lawyer out in the field, like seeing people who may be retiring or ending their career versus people who are just starting, like how, are you a little bit more optimistic for, like, I guess, our future and the ways that we're going to develop policy and, thoughts?
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I went to a really crunchy law school in New York, right? Like, my law school was founded specifically to increase access to the system, and it was meant to sort of lower barriers. And the people I met in law school were almost 2-to-1 do-gooders who had that as their desired outcome. And if I talk to the students that I've had at Hastings, for example, a lot of them sort of speak that talk, but their behavior doesn't exactly manifest the same desire that I saw in my context. So, when I talk to new attorneys at my workplace or when I meet people, it seems like everyone kind of has the same lingo down, and that makes me hopeful that, like, maybe we're all at least kind of arriving to a similar moral understanding of what the problems are. But as you know, like, if everyone is taking that through graduate school and then they go work for Goldman Sachs, and then they go work for Coca-Cola, then, or they go work for a major private prison and are defending their actions against Eighth Amendment challenges all day, then that really didn't change the outcome. So I don't know that I'm, like, more optimistic about the profession as a whole, but I am really heartened by the fact that, when I was in law school, people talking about changing the bar exam were like sort of like grizzled people who from the 70s who, like, no one was listening to. And now that conversation, especially after the pandemic, has become a really central part of how state bars are behaving. So maybe the change is just too slow to see all at once, and maybe I should be more optimistic. But, I think in general, lawyers are still lawyers, and they're still sort of conservative with both, like, a lowercase and a capital C. So I haven't seen, like, a giant change, but, I see reasons to at least be hopeful that if we have the same moral language, we can start to understand each other differently and understand how the system that we might be helping to perpetuate falls short of that, and maybe our own role in fixing it. I mean, maybe that's the silver lining.
Thank you, Keith, for that question. And thank you, Phil, for trying to end us with a sliver of hope note.
People
there.
don't come
It
to me for hope, you know, that's great. So I like that.
Sounds like we have a lot more work to do, and we uncovered a lot. I feel like we need to have you back to continue this conversation, but I want to thank you for being here. This was great. And I want to thank everybody in the audience for participating. This session was being recorded, and I'll send this out. Feel free to share it with your networks. We look forward to having you back and seeing you soon and seeing the great work that you're doing. It's about past 1 p.m. Pacific time. So we're getting some nice comments in the chat box. Thank you again. But I'll let all of you get back to your day. Have a great one.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.